Well, if you've found the relentless politicking this week a bit much, don't imagine relief's in sight with the parliamentary mid-year break. The carbon tax starts on Sunday. If you believe the government, most Australians won't feel a thing. But if you trust the opposition, making ends meet is going to get a lot harder. Heather Hewitt has been trying to cut through the spin to get to the reality of the carbon tax's impact.
Australia has the biggest carbon footprint per person in the developed world, with a heavy reliance on coal-fired electricity. The government's carbon tax is supposed to address that. In just 3 days, it finally comes in. And after months of claims and counterclaims flung at us by politicians, we'll start to find out for ourselves how it really affects us.
Most Australians, from their own personal experience, are rightly, in many cases, cynical about saying that something's going to change, and how can it possibly be the case that we're going to have no pain? Why are we doing this? What's the whole point?
Just as you recall, when the GST came in, there was a big spike in inflation, a one-off spike. That'll happen again with the carbon tax, and it's assessed at around about 0.7%.
While there'll be a small increase in everyone's cost of doing business, I don't think there'll be an immediate impact on prices to the customer.
The big point will be that the sky won't fall on the 1st of July. Most people's lives will be very much as they were before.
The predicted impact of the carbon tax, or lack of it, on our daily lives depends on who you talk to. But first, it's timely in the lead-up to its introduction to be reminded about the basics of who and what the carbon tax is aimed at.
We have the highest emissions per unit of GDP, gross domestic product. So Australia is miles behind the rest of our competitors in the developed world in terms of the emissions intensity of our economy. We have to get started.
Well, the companies that will pay big will be the ones with the very large emissions, and there's only a few hundred of these. Energy companies like the big gas generators in the Latrobe Valley and the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, the companies like Origin and AGL, big manufacturers with their own greenhouse gas emissions who also use a lot of electricity, but the direct emissions, such as steel manufacturers, aluminium manufacturers, cement manufacturers.
In other words, it's the nation's biggest polluters who are targeted, and the government has 294 of them on its list. This is how it will work. They'll pay a tax of $23 for every tonne of carbon dioxide they produce, and will have to buy permits from the government for their greenhouse gas emissions. This is forecast to cut 1.1 billion tonnes of carbon pollution by 2020.
We don't pay, they do, and the question then is, what happens to those costs?
And that's what's open to debate. The cost of electricity is the big talking point, and in fact prices have already gone up in the past 4 years because of billions of dollars being spent upgrading poles, lines and substations. The government and the power companies say further price increases because of the carbon tax should be minimal.
The regulators in the various states have made a clear decision on this. It varies a little bit, but for the ordinary household, the average household, it'll be somewhere between $3.30, $3.60. About the price of 1 cup of coffee a week per family.
So what about other fears of more substantial price rises in areas such as housing? Government compensation to industries like aluminium smelting, cement and steel, who claim they'll be hard hit by the tax, is supposed to prevent this.
Now, all three of those industries will receive 94.5% of their carbon permits for free.
What that means is that if those industries themselves are being compensated for the carbon price, obviously there's nothing to pass through, and so some of those major inputs to the cost of housing won't be as big as some people thought. So I think you'd expect to see, like a lot of other commodities, the increases won't be very large at all.
That forecast seems to apply as well to supermarket shoppers. While the big chains rely on refrigeration for food products, Woolworths, for one, doesn't expect more expensive electricity to lead to immediate price rises in its stores. And here's why.
Since 2007, we've invested nearly $95 million on making our stores more energy efficient. And that is delivering a saving to us and the ability to keep our prices low.
Many large companies contacted by 7:30 tell a similar story, that they've been anticipating a carbon tax for years.
So as a business, we feel very prepared for the implementation of a carbon tax. But I can understand companies that are only just starting now to make that investment would be quite worried about what the impact would be.
The ones who might be a little bit less sure, the medium-sized companies, medium-sized manufacturers, who may not yet have really thought through how this is going to work for them.
Especially at the smaller scale where they will have difficulty in passing on prices, that there will be an impact on profitability, and what concerns us is that that will ultimately have an effect on employment.
This family business producing Italian-style sausages at Penrith on the outskirts of Sydney falls right into that category.
Today we bring in the fresh pork, we mince it up, we add the seasoning.
The Malosis have been in the game for more than 60 years, and the looming carbon tax has suddenly hit them.
Up till about 3-4 weeks ago, it really didn't particularly concern me at all, till my refrigeration mechanic gave me a call and started telling me about the different costs associated with our gas. And then just of this week here, I started getting price rises from our different suppliers, our transport company.
Roland Malosi expects his refrigerant gas costs alone to triple after July the 1st.
And it's something that we now have to consider in our pricing of our products.
There will be inevitable price rises, some legitimate and some not, and they'll all be monitored by the consumer watchdog, the ACCC.
We're after people who are setting out to mislead consumers and dupe them into accepting a higher price increase or to buy a product they otherwise wouldn't.
To compensate consumers on low and middle incomes facing higher prices, the government is advancing increased family and pensioner payments, along with tax cuts, and will ramp up its advertising campaign next week as the carbon tax takes effect.
You'll benefit from the next part of this package through tax cuts.
What happens is we will then start to see some very clear price signals about some things that will become more expensive and some things that will become relatively not so expensive.
It's a waiting game that could take several days, even weeks, to play out.
And we've invited both the Prime Minister Julia Gillard and the Opposition Leader Tony Abbott to join the program next week to discuss the carbon tax, among other issues.